Hello everyone, and welcome to this session where we'll be discussing the importance of objectively measuring the privacy risk that data sets contain so that well-informed decisions about the use and protection of that data may be made. Why should you listen to me? I'm Dr. Maurice Coyle. I'm the Chief Data Scientist at Truata, and we spend all of our time working out how to ensure that our customers can extract value from their data without compromising on the trust and privacy of their customers. And the first step on that journey is to understand how much risk a data set contains, hence the title. The inspiration for this talk came from a quote by a famous scientist called Lord Kelvin. And his quote was, "To measure is to know. If you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it." Lord Kelvin went on to say that if you can't measure something, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. And this concept is really central to today's presentation, since we argue that if you can't objectively quantify privacy within a data set, then your understanding of the risk that it contains is vague and highly subjective at best. So let's talk about the market forces that we observe today. Firstly, companies are under a lot of pressure to leverage data to drive business growth. They're to maintain a competitive advantage and also to understand their business as it scales and as commerce goes global. There's a severe imperative to use data to drive that growth. A conflicting force then is that global data protection regulations are increasing, so that companies are being forced to adapt and modify how they have historically collected and processed data so that they respect and preserve the privacy of their customers. And so you can obviously see how these two forces are in conflict with each other. At the same time, privacy and trust are also becoming differentiators, so that companies who successfully balance those two conflicting forces actually have a competitive advantage. And in fact, 66% of customers say they're more likely to be loyal to a company if they trust them to use their personal data appropriately. Data can unlock business value in a number of ways. First of all, customer growth is made a lot more possible when data is used to understand customer behavior and to understand the dynamics behind how customers engage with and interact with the company. It drives revenue and it also increases the stickiness and the relationship with customers. Operational efficiencies are also possible when the dynamics within a company are understood. A deeper understanding of core metrics and the dynamics of an organization means that greater efficiency and cost savings may be introduced. And then finally, data monetization, which is a broad category that enables companies to develop new revenue streams and opportunities for growth. The road to this compliant form of analytics is actually quite challenging. Under the GDPR, for example, a lawful basis is needed for each act of processing of data. There are 6 lawful bases. Here we've depicted three common ones that are used. First of all, an act of processing may be necessary for the performance of a contract. That's what you would call a primary act of processing. Legitimate interest is a category which is used quite broadly, and typically if an act of processing is within the reasonable expectation of a customer, then legitimate interest may apply. However, it's also become quite clear from the opinions and guidance issued by a number of regulators that legitimate interest does have boundaries, and so companies need to tread carefully when they're using legitimate interest as their lawful basis. Consent is also frequently used. Consent, where under GDPR, means that consent has to be obtained for each act of processing, for each vendor that's being used, and also that it must be highly visible, unambiguous, and also opt-in consent. This can cause trouble because getting customers to provide such consent means that uptake can be quite low. And so fully compliant consent frameworks can typically result in low uptake, and we'll see how that can have an impact on analytics. At the same time, the GDPR has brought in strict requirements on how data is used for analytics. First of all, companies have to be transparent in all types of data and all active processing that they're engaging in. They must minimize the amount of data that they collect and process, so that only the minimum amount of data required for lawful active processing is stored and processed. And then also very strict retention periods are imposed, so data can only be retained for as long as it is needed for an active processing, and the data retention period must be justified as well under GDPR. And then finally, there are a number of data subject rights, such as the right to be forgotten, data access rights, the data portability rights. These all must be supported by a company, and these can affect the analytics that are performed on data, because when right to be forgotten rights are asserted, data is removed and the data universe becomes unstable. Similarly, with consent as a lawful basis, as mentioned, the data universe is changed, is reduced, and as a result, analytics that are performed over consented data can be noisy and inaccurate. And by definition, people who provide consent are biased because they've done something different than non-consenting users. So all of these things together can mean that analytics performed under some of these frameworks can be either inaccurate or unstable. And that's obviously a problem where business decisions are being made. There is a solution. Analytics over anonymized data is actually not subject to privacy laws. And that's quite an appealing thing to try and achieve. However, and as a result, the bar or the threshold on what is considered to be truly anonymized data under the GDPR has been raised considerably. And it is true that quite often data that is anonymized in-house is actually still considered personal data, because as long as the original data and the supposedly anonymized data are kept and controlled by the same company, then there is a technical ability to link those data sets. And therefore, a number of the regulator opinions and also the Article 29 Working Party opinion on anonymization technologies make it very clear that these data should be considered personal data. So to enable companies to navigate this quite challenging environment, we've seen the rise of a category of solution called privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs for short. So this has been an answer to all of these increasing privacy concerns and also the requirement for companies to use data to drive their businesses forward. You'll have seen some of the names that are appearing on screen within the media, and also possibly have adopted some of these within your organization. So differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, synthetic data, these are all quite popular technologies that are being used. And indeed, they are very powerful and useful for protecting the privacy of data, but they do come with a caveat. And that caveat is that they must be used mindfully and with a full understanding of what they're doing. There's no silver bullet when it comes to privacy enhancing technologies. And depending on the configuration, the outputs can actually retain quite significant amounts of re-identification risk. So we'll be talking about some of that as we go through this talk. We'll also refer to what we call the privacy utility curve. So as you can see here, privacy is on one axis, utility is on the other axis. And as privacy increases, utility decreases. This is a function and a feature of all privacy enhancing technologies. At the top left, we see the lowest analytic utility, but the highest privacy. And in fact, if you want to guarantee 100% privacy, the best action to take is to delete your data. So obviously, there is zero analytic utility in where there is no data, but there's also the highest possible privacy there. And also down the bottom right, then we have the original data, and this has the highest possible utility. However, there's no additional privacy in place. And so these are the two extremes on the curve. And a common misconception we see in the market is that by applying a privacy enhancing technology, the position on this curve goes straight up. So you lose no utility while your privacy increases. And this is a claim that that is out there in many commercial offerings around privacy enhancing technologies, when in fact the application of any privacy enhancing technology typically moves you backwards and up on the curve. So utility does increase, especially when you're talking about general analytic utility. So being able to perform any analytic function over data, that decreases as you increase privacy. There are techniques for producing, for single use cases, well protected data that has high analytic utility, but again, the overall utility of a data set is dramatically reduced then. And so while privacy enhancing technologies are very powerful, they're ready for mainstream adoption. To date, many of them have been in the lab and been subject to academic research. They're at the point where they're ready for commercial adoption and they're commercially viable. However, we feel that the final piece of that puzzle is that we must be able to quantify the privacy risk before and after a privacy enhancing technology is applied, so that the impact or the effect of that technology, both on utility and privacy, is known. So why should we quantify privacy? We just need to look at some of the opinions and guidelines that have been issued by regulators, and there's a number of instances in ENISA, the cybersecurity agency, and also Spanish regulator, and a number of other regulator opinions where it's quite clear that mechanisms for objectively estimating the likelihood of re-identification is required. So measurement of risk is important. Risk assessment is mentioned as being a requirement. And in the world of big data, desk-based risk assessments where humans are applying their subjective expertise, it's simply not sufficient anymore. Some other reasons why measuring risk is important: every data set is different. The context of usage heavily influences the risk profile of a data set. So a data set that will be published on the web has a very different risk profile than a data set that will be used internally by a single employee. So understanding these sources of risks means that informed decisions can be made around the use and the anonymization or protection of data. And then also with all privacy enhancing technologies, knowing how an algorithm works and knowing how you've configured the output is step one, but quite often it stops there and there's a lack of insight into the nature of the output. And we're going to talk about why that's important to understand. If we look at the Article 29 Working Party opinion on anonymization techniques again, we'll see a number of different privacy enhancing technologies discussed. And this table taken from that paper makes it very clear that these are not silver bullets. In many cases, the risk of singling out linkability or inference exists even after they've been applied. And in other cases, it may still exist. And where it may still exist is an indication that these techniques can be configured in a way to continue to have re-identification risk. And so we're going to explain and show how that can happen with an example later. Firstly, I thought it would be useful to just show with a fairly popular example how re-identification risk can still remain within a supposedly anonymized data set. So there is a data set available which shows the journeys taken within New York City within cabs. And so this data set has had all direct identifiers removed. It contains the date, the source and destination, the fare and the tip for each journey. And so you can obviously see from the two samples here that these aren't identifiable because a lot of people may be traveling within those places on a particular day. However, one researcher went to Google image search and they Googled for celebrities getting into cabs NYC. They used the metadata embedded within those images to identify celebrities where they were getting into or out of cabs, and then they were able to link up a number of these journeys with celebrities, and they were able to identify the fact that Bradley Cooper and Jessica Alba don't tip. So a mildly embarrassing thing for the world to know. You could argue it's not the most groundbreaking or sensitive of information, but it quite clearly shows that the claim of anonymization of this data set is certainly questionable. And then a more sensitive example would be where this map was produced showing drop-offs for cabs that originated at the Hustler nightclub. And yellow dots here indicate repeat visitors, and that could mean that this is a home address or a business address of someone, and that could be obviously very sensitive and personal information. So again, we're just showing that these supposedly anonymized data sets do contain and can contain re-identification risk. So without quantifying that, companies are exposed to regulatory scrutiny, fines, and sanctions. And if you're familiar with the game Guess Who, you'll be aware that it proceeds by asking a set of questions about an individual and progressively narrowing down the search until you've found a particular person. And so, are you wearing a hat? Do you have particular colored hair, etc., etc.? Each time you reduce the focus until you find the individual you're looking for. And a lot of these attacks proceed like this, except they don't proceed by asking one question after another. They proceed by knowing several facts up front and then searching for those within the data set. And so our privacy metrics specifically quantify how identifiable individuals are using these kind of attacks. So how do we measure privacy risk? This is the really important part where we want to discuss some of the metrics and some of the questions that can be asked to help understand the impact of privacy enhancing technologies and whether the desired level of protection has been imposed or obtained. We're going to talk about re-identification risks and privacy metrics using a set of terms, and useful to introduce those here just so everyone understands what we're talking about. When we talk about re-identification, we'll make the distinction between identifiers and quasi-identifiers. An identifier would be something like an email address, a name, a phone number that is directly linkable to an individual, while a quasi-identifier then is a field or a set of fields or attributes that together don't appear to directly identify an individual, but can be very closely linked to either an individual event or record or to the data subject themselves. And so quasi-identifiers, or we call them fingerprints, they can be used to re-identify individuals. So in the New York City cab, for instance, the combination of date, source, destination, and amount, they could all be considered as a quasi-identifier. And in fact, the researcher only used the date and time and the source or destination, and that they were able to identify exact cab rides that celebrities had taken. And then the ensuing risk is direct or indirect risk. So a direct risk is one that is obvious within the data set, and then an indirect risk is where you have some external data set or information that used to re-identify. And in this case, Google Images was that source, that external source of information. And then when we talk about privacy metrics, we will discuss data level and data subject level. A data level metric is one that examines a characteristic of the data. It measures some statistical property, and that leads to a re-identification risk. Whereas a data subject level considers all records or all data associated to a data subject in doing the same thing to understand, do they have a statistical characteristic that helps to identify that data subject. And then we'll talk about one-dimensional versus multi-dimensional. One-dimensional simply means we have a single attribute, a single piece of information, and multi-dimensional means we know a number of things about a particular record or a data subject to perform a re-identification. So first up, there are a number of questions that can be asked of all privacy-enhancing technologies. We've listed some of the popular ones here, that can be used to understand in advance and without looking at the data, what is the likely privacy and utility characteristics of the resulting data set. K-anonymity, L-diversity, and T-closeness are a family of formal methods that allow the hiding of individual records within groups of similar records or similar data subjects. And so the questions that need to be asked about these techniques would be things like, how diverse are the values in the columns under scrutiny? That would help you understand whether a homogeneity attack is possible. How are sensitive attributes distributed? That would help you understand if a skewness attack is possible. And then for differential privacy, there's a very important privacy parameter called epsilon, and the selection of that helps you understand, was a privacy first or a utility first configuration chosen? And that helps you understand then what the resulting output will look like. And similarly with synthetic data, you need to understand how are privacy and utility balanced. specifically, how are the relationships between columns retained when learning the model that will be used to generate a synthetic data set? And then also, how were values obtained? Were they obtained by sampling from original distributions, or were they randomly selected? So they all help you understand, is there likely to be singling out linkability and inference? So these are kind of questions to be asked, and I think, as you'll see, by objectively quantifying the level of these privacy risks, it helps to answer some of these questions. So when we talk about privacy metrics, we're typically talking about two broad categories, one being comparison metrics and one being fingerprinting. So when we say comparison, we're talking about comparing the before and after data sets that have been produced by applying a particular privacy enhancing technique. We look at data level and data subject level metrics for comparison purposes. And I think we'll just show one example here, which is where singling out can exist in a supposedly anonymized data set. So the first and last name as direct identifiers have been removed from the data set to produce the so-called, as I say, anonymized data set. If we look within that data set, we notice there's only one female oncologist in Vancouver. And if we look back in the original data set, if we compare it, we see that that same record exists. So by simply linking these two data sets with unique values, we have quite easily identified Alice Miller. And this is why, as earlier mentioned, where anonymized and original data sets are stored or controlled by the same code, I think these records exist. The other fingerprinting or quantify identifiers. Again, we look at level and data subject level, and it's very important to consider one-dimensional versus multi-dimensional, or single versus multi-attributes. And another example here for fingerprinting is where we have this data set which has a name, occupation, location, and whether the person has a driving license. And by applying calculations to these, to different combinations of these fields, we can find how linkable back to the original these fields are. And so you can see that occupation and location have very high linkability back. So if you know those two facts, then it's quite possible that you can re-identify an individual. And this will feed into things like synthetic data generation or differential privacy later, because more care needs to be taken with these fields, and further anonymization may be applied in terms of a generalization or addition of noise. There are a number of techniques that can be used to further anonymize or distance these from the original. At the same time, we can look at the formal methods and the guarantees such as k-anonymity, and we can use these metrics to measure how k-anonymous is a data set. That's a really important and valuable thing to be able to do, because it helps you understand, before you do anything, are the sensitive attributes, are they k-anonymous? So by doing this objectively, you get this really useful view into your data. And then also, by looking at the statistical characteristics of a data set, you can take an attack-based view of your data. So you can measure how likely is a homogeneity attack, how likely is a skewness attack. And that really, again, helps you to understand what actions may be needed in order to further protect your data. So I suppose if there's a takeaway from this whole section, it's that objectively quantifying privacy is possible. There are a series of techniques that can be used to weed out and identify a very rich set of privacy risk metrics from a data set. So again, we want to just show an example of this in action, and we chose synthetic data as being quite a popular technique that's been offered and mentioned within the media about how to protect data. We have seen quite often people are making claims such as, you know, you can have full utility within your data set without sacrificing privacy and in a synthetic data set. And sometimes synthetic data is positioned as being fake data and therefore inherently safe. And this simply isn't true. And we'll show an example of why this could lead to unnecessary or unknown exposure within the data set. First of all, we'll talk about the types of synthetic data. So randomly generated synthetic data is the safest kind. It obeys the data schema, and then values are randomly generated. So it doesn't bear any resemblance to the data set except by accident or coincidence. The next flavor or family of synthetic data algorithms they generate uncorrelated data. So again, the values are sampled from the distributions of the original, so they will bear a resemblance to the original data at a column level, but the relationships between the columns are not maintained because they're generated independently. And so you can end up with variable risk here depending on the characteristics of the original data set. But typically an uncorrelated data set is much safer because it retains or duplicates much less of the original data. And then finally, correlated data comes from a family of algorithms that seek to retain those relationships between fields, so that you have very analytically robust synthetic data, and also the values are sampled from the original distributions as well. And while this has very high analytic utility, it can also contain very high risk. And so the claims that it is impossible to re-identify someone from data generated using these techniques is very shaky at best. And so, as mentioned, as we increase in sophistication in terms of analytic accuracy with synthetic data, we also increase in privacy risk. So I'd like to just talk about correlations. They are very important. We've mentioned them a few times, and just to make sure that everyone understands what we're talking about. We have a dummy data set here, which has the day, an individual's name, and the fruit that they purchased on that day. A kind of a basic form of anonymization might be to remove the name and then use a synthetic data generation mechanism to learn a model of this data set so that a synthetic version of it can be produced. This very simple model might learn that there's 4 records where an orange is bought on Monday, there's 1 record where a banana is bought on Tuesday, and so on. And so these are based on maintaining relationships between columns and also sampling from the values that are in the original data set. So if this data set was used, if this model was used to generate a data set the same size as the original, you would essentially reproduce the table on the left. And so while it may be claimed that this is anonymized because there's no name field, it also is reproducing the data set that we already had. And so the re-identification risk becomes a little more apparent when we again look back at the original and we notice that on Monday it's always Matt that buys an orange, on Friday it's always Alice that buys an apple, and so on. And so if the additional information is held or the original data set is still available, then the synthetic version of that data set also contains a large amount of linkability or re-identification risk. We look at the Article 29 Working Party opinion. Again, there's a couple of examples where it's very clear that the correlations between attributes need to be taken into account, and that inferences may be still possible if correlations are maintained or if they have strong relationships within the data set. So these things need to be considered when using techniques like synthetic data. And then finally, I'm going to show you this example of a risk report or risk interface using Truata's Calibrate product. We built a synthetic data set using one of these correlated techniques over a census data set. And one of the fingerprints or the quasi-identifiers that Calibrate found was this sequence of 10 columns: occupation, hours per week, education, etc. And within that data set, that set of columns had an 86% ability to re-identify an individual. So it's quite high in terms of uniqueness when you have these 10 fields. And probably most important for this conversation, when we ran that synthetic data technique and then compared the results across the original and the synthetic data set, we found that around 56% of those quasi-identifiers were reproduced. And so without getting into too much of the detail of the re-identification risk, I think it's quite clear that re-identification is definitely possible within this data set. So if there are a number of takeaways for this talk, firstly, we hope it's become clear that privacy risk and measurement of it is very nuanced. It's more than just direct identifiers. There's several sources of risk within a data set, and there's several attacks that can be made on data sets. The context of usage is incredibly important and can dramatically affect the privacy risk and also the utility aspects of a data set. Privacy risk can and should always be measured before and after using privacy enhancing technologies, and also that there's no one size fits all approach to this topic. Finally, Pets are powerful, but they're not a silver bullet. So privacy enhancing technologies should be used, but they should be used very mindfully, and they should be used in full awareness of the privacy and the utility impacts that they introduce, so that better informed decisions can be made. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions, my email's on the screen, and I hope you've enjoyed this talk and taken some interesting points away from it. Thank you very much.